From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden issues an executive order to shut down the southern border to some asylum seekers, a move immediately criticized on both sides of the aisle. We'll get reaction from Capitol Hill with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis.
Biden today also denying Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is playing politics with the war in Gaza as Hamas joins Israel in balking over a ceasefire agreement.
And India's election delivers a shock result as Prime Minister Modi's party loses its majority in parliament, even as he vows to remain in power. We'll have details and potential implications for U.S.-India relations. Kaylee, here we are again, elections at issue on both sides of the globe. And a lot of folks are pointing to our own elections here as a motivator for Joe Biden to make some big news today.
Well, of course, he is seeking a second term in office, and he is doing so knowing that he has a few weaknesses, one being the economy, the other being the issue of the border. And he took aim at that issue with an executive order earlier today.
Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants will be restricted from receiving asylum at our southern border unless they seek it after entering through an established lawful process. And those who seek to come to the United States legally, for example, by making an appointment and coming to a port of entry, asylum will still be available to them.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner, who covers the White House for us. Akayla, it's great to have you back at the table. This is big news. Anything involving the border, we know one of the most important issues for voters in this campaign. But this president pointed to the last president, Donald Trump, as a big reason why he was here today.
Yeah, this has been fascinating to watch because this is really the result of an evolution for President Biden over many months. We saw him run for office really criticizing some of the language that we saw Donald Trump using, and now slowly start to see him to echo some of that language and rhetoric we saw from Donald Trump. Biden started talking about shutting down the border, and that's exactly what we saw him do today here. He's basically lowering that threshold for the amount of people who can enter every day to 2,500. And that's pretty significant because just last month, we saw more than 4,000 people encountering the border every day. So that is going to be a huge reduction here. And it will only begin to open again once thresholds are back down to 1,500 for at least a week. So we could see the border closed for potentially days or weeks under this new order.
And of course, not everyone is thrilled with this new order, but it depends on who you ask. House Republicans, leadership, in fact, in a statement, calls it nothing more than a desperate political stunt to try and stabilize his plummeting poll numbers. Well, you can find some Democrats, progressives specifically, who suggest that Biden is defying American values with this action. Who actually is happy with this?
That's a great question, Kayla. You do have some moderates, people in swing states who are applauding this decision today. And that is, of course, because this is a political vulnerability for Democrats, as it is for Republicans as well. But what you're seeing here now is with progressives specifically is they are not happy specifically that Biden has not pursued legal pathways for people, for dreamers, for DACA recipients. That is something that they want, quote unquote, positive actions or affirmative actions for migrants. And that is something they have criticized him over and over again when it comes to regulations that he's pursued in the executive branch. And of course, that is not in the executive order today.
Yeah. Well, he's also pointing at the Capitol, at Congress, knowing there was a deal struck in the Senate that we've talked for hours collectively about here on this program. He blamed Donald Trump for that never seeing the light of day. But we also have to acknowledge that Joe Biden today said this is not enough, that Congress still needs to act. The funding for the border isn't in place, and this will eventually need to be a legislative solution.
And I think especially because this could be struck down in court. We saw something similar happen under Donald Trump. We have ACLU saying that they're reviewing this action and they have serious concerns. So we could be in a position where back at square one, where we have no major reforms here. So I think some of those criticisms have some weight here because, again, we might be back to square one.
Well, and considering the back to square one nature of it, of course, as you were drawing the comparison with Donald Trump, Trump tried to do a lot when it came to the border during his administration as well and had some challenges in court. How quickly do we expect the lawsuits could come, Akayla?
They could come any day now, especially because this is going into effect at midnight.
All right.
Yeah.
Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner, who covers the White House for us. Thank you so much. Now, after President Biden's remarks on the executive order earlier today, he also was asked about the Middle East, specifically about how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is handling the war. And he answered that question as he walked out of the room.
Is Prime Minister Netanyahu playing politics with the war?
I don't think so. He's trying to work out a serious problem he has.
Those comments arguably running counter to an interview he gave to Time magazine, where he said that there's every reason for people to assume Netanyahu is prolonging the war for political reasons. Let's go now to Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, who covers national security for us. So, Dan, you could arguably see how one point counters the other, but it also just speaks to the very fraught nature of not just the Biden-Netanyahu relationship, but U.S.-Israel relationship right now.
Yeah, certainly this is not an easy time for U.S.-Israel relations in the macro sense, but also as this deal sort of comes together and seems to fall apart a bit. If we go back to Friday afternoon, it seemed like there was a ceasefire deal potentially imminent. That, of course, did not come to fruition. And so now here we are, Tuesday of the following week, where all sides are still trying to work something out, but the U.S. and Israeli positions seem to be getting farther apart, at least in terms of rhetoric, although you did see President Biden give Netanyahu some cover with his comment today. So.
We also saw headlines today that Israel was preparing to accept a deal. Hamas said that it would not accept a deal without a permanent ceasefire. Does that remain the sticking point, something shorter term versus permanently laying down their arms?
Well, I don't think that Israel wants to take anything off the table in terms of eradicating Hamas, is the term that they've used, or continuing to pursue their military operations in Gaza. They don't want to go necessarily as far as a permanent ceasefire yet, because that would kind of take that option off the table. And obviously, from Hamas's perspective and from the perspective of the folks in Gaza, they would like to see a permanent ceasefire, because it would mean on top of some other things, a easing of the humanitarian situation there potentially. But it's a very difficult political position, including here in the U.S., for Biden to thread that needle, because he's getting criticism not just from the right, but also from the left on this, just like with immigration, as Akayla said.
Yeah, very hard to win on these issues. We did hear from the State Department earlier today, specifically the spokesman, Matthew Miller, who spoke about Israel and whether or not it was going to accept the deal that Biden laid out last week. This is what he said.
We are convinced it is the case that Israel is ready to implement this deal. As I said, it's their proposal put forward by the government, and they have maintained to us they're ready to implement it. Doesn't mean there aren't voices inside Israel, and voices even inside the Israeli government are opposed to it. But the government, speaking on behalf of the government, has said they support this proposal and are ready to stand behind that, and we take them at their word.
It begs the question, Dan, as to whether maybe that Israel is prepared to implement phase one, but it's phase two where things get really sticky. If there isn't agreement on what phase two actually looks like on the part of Israel and Hamas, will phase one ever happen in the form of a temporary agreement?
Well, certainly the devil is always in the details. And I think here, again, you sort of see Netanyahu trying to preserve some maneuvering room for himself with his suggestion that this deal is not yet ripe. And the U.S. still trying to preserve the pressure that it has exerted on Israel to bring this deal to fruition, to have a ceasefire here, with the comments that the State Department spokesperson made. So essentially all sides are trying to get to yes here, but the incentives are very different. Biden has his domestic political incentives, certainly international incentive as well. Israel has theirs, Netanyahu has his, and Hamas has theirs. And so we just don't have a meeting of the minds yet, but we're closer now than we were several weeks ago, so that is something.
There's been an argument over the timing of Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to Congress as he was invited by the Speaker of the House. This lands on a date in which the president's out of the country. A Jewish holiday conflicts with the date. Do we have an update on whether this may or may not happen?
No update as of yet, but certainly in the coming days. I mean, just today the House recently voted for sanctions on the International Criminal Court in reaction to some action that court took against Netanyahu. So that is obviously laying the groundwork for him to come here, speak to both chambers of Congress, and make his case. So that's something that we'll be looking forward to.
It'll be a big deal if he makes it happen. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thank you so much for the great reporting. Coming up, we'll have reaction to President Biden's border executive action that we've been talking about with New York Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's nothing wrong with the president taking this executive action, but I think it's important for the American people to realize that this is woefully insufficient to address the crisis that he has created at the U.S.-Mexico border. The crisis is being felt not just in communities along the border, but being felt in my home state of Wisconsin and across the country.
That was Republican Congressman Brian Stile of Wisconsin talking with us earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio, sharing his thoughts on President Biden's executive order on border security that we've been talking about. He introduced the EO today, and joining us now is Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, the Republican from New York, spoke passionately about the border last time she was with us, and back with us today. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg. I saw your colleague, Congressman Tom Suozzi, in the East Room with the president today. Your governor, Kathy Hochul, was there. Can Joe Biden take the border off the table politically in New York?
No, I mean, this executive order doesn't really address the root of the problem. I mean, he passed 60 executive orders when he first came into office that completely dismantled our border, and that is what really created this crisis that we're seeing across America, and particularly in New York City, that we didn't see under any other Republican or Democrat president in our nation's history. And so this is really, it is something, but it's certainly not what we need. We passed a measure in the House, as you know, over a year ago. The Senate won't take up our bill, and even ones that we passed on a bipartisan basis, the Senate won't take up any of those bills for some reason, at least allow for a vote to take place. What I would say is this is certainly political. It is certainly the president's attempt, because he sees the poll numbers. He sees that this is the top issue on voters' minds right now, because they're seeing things happening like what happened yesterday in New York City, where 2 NYPD officers were shot by someone who was here illegally, and he came under the president's program. And to make matters worse, when you dig more into this individual's case, he went to a Chicago immigration judge, and his case was basically dismissed. It was closed. So he's in the country, no status. He's here now illegally, right? He's committing crimes. He was a suspect in a string of robberies across New York City, and then he shoots 2 of our police officers. So as long as we're going to continue to allow individuals who are criminals to enter our country, which he's going to do because there's no real method of vetting them. You need to completely secure our borders, and the section that he's referring to in this executive order, which is Section 212F of the Immigration Naturalization Act, in that it gives him the authority to shut down the border completely. Not to mention, he can undo the 60 executive orders that he put in place that created this crisis. So this is, unfortunately, window dressing, but we're going to continue to fight to ensure that, we actually get our border secure. Whether that means we have to elect a new president, that's fine, or whether we got to win the Senate back, but we have to get it done.
Okay.
And one last thing, I just want to say to the American people, when you get a poll, when somebody calls you to take a poll, make sure you continue to tell them that the border is the #1 issue, because clearly it's having an impact, and that is exactly what today is about, just responding to those polls.
Well, Congresswoman, the president today in his remarks noted that while he is willing in this case to take executive action, that the kind of securing of the border you speak of can only really be accomplished with congressional action. And I know you just alluded to their H.R. 2, the House-passed bill, yet that passed with not a single Democratic vote. It was not bipartisan. Is it time to start from scratch and actually work on a new bipartisan solution?
Again, the president took 60 executive actions that destroyed our border.
But I'm asking what you and your colleagues can do.
No, I understand, but for the president to say that is a lie, because he's the one who took 60 executive actions to undo the border, and he can undo it today if he wants to. He can fix it today if he wants to via executive order, the same way he broke it. Now, with our legislation, we did have another bipartisan bill that had tied the foreign aid that was passed. And then, unfortunately, leadership decided to just do the foreign aid without the border security provisions. I had a real problem with that, which is why I didn't support the entire foreign aid package just bits of it. But what I'll say is, the other thing is, we have other bills that we passed that at least would address the issues of people who are here committing crimes. Those passed with bipartisan support. Why can't we get Chuck Schumer to at least take those up if that's what we can agree on at the moment? And the other thing is, in New York City, why is this still a problem? Because New York City won't cooperate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They passed a bill in the City Council under Bill de Blasio that kicked ICE out of Rikers Island, that prohibited NYPD from cooperating with ICE to deport individuals. So what you have right now in New York City is a situation where people are being arrested for crimes and they're being released back onto the street instead of being turned over for deportation. So you don't have cooperation to get the existing individuals who are here committing crimes out of the country. So I think it's a real combination of things. I'm happy to work in a bipartisan manner. I've showed that as a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and we did come up with a solution that addressed our support for our allies who are in war right now, coupled with real border security measures. Some of the provisions that were in H.R. 2, we had Democratic sponsors of that bill. But unfortunately, again, leadership did not decide to go with that on both sides, the Senate and the House, unfortunately, and we are where we are.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, Congresswoman, while you're with us here, and based on your view from the Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. You spent some time asking tough questions of Anthony Fauci yesterday, getting into some of his professional actions during the COVID pandemic. I'd love for our viewers and listeners to get a sense of that, and we'll ask you about that. Here's how this went with Dr. Fauci yesterday.
Dr. Fauci, did you delete any emails or records related to the Wuhan lab or the origins of the virus?
No, I did not.
Okay. Dr. Morins said in a May 2021 email, he indicated that he was connecting people to you in a, quote, secret back channel. Do you know what he was referring to?
I don't have any idea what he's talking about. There is no back channel at NIAID.
Congresswoman, I wonder what the end game is here with more than one crisis burning. We just spent 5 minutes talking about one at the border. Will this hearing lead to legislation? Is there a bill that you're working on that will come from relitigating COVID?
Well, yeah, I think that, first of all, in order for us to prevent the next pandemic, we need to know the origins of this pandemic. And unfortunately, leadership at NIH and Dr. Fauci have spent so much time suppressing the lab leak theory, number one. Now he's saying it is potentially from the lab leak. That is actually what the FBI and the Department of Energy has indicated as well from their investigations. We passed legislation to declassify all the documents. The president refuses to do it. He refuses to comply with federal law despite it passing unanimously out of the House and the Senate. So we're trying to get to the bottom of where what the origins and the role that NIH may have played or support of taxpayer money. We know that Department of State money, Department of Defense money, USAID, NIH money all made its way to this Wuhan lab via EcoHealth. EcoHealth, we've gotten a result there. They are now debarred. They are prohibited from receiving any more federal grants. That is a result of the work of our subcommittee. And the issue that the clip that you just played was interesting because you have the senior advisor to Dr. Fauci saying that he had the secret back channel, that Dr. Fauci was using his personal Gmail to communicate on NIH business to avoid freedom of information laws. And then you have Dr. Fauci saying that that's not true, that he doesn't even know what his senior advisor is talking about. So someone is lying to the committee, which is perjury. And destruction of government records is an offense as well. It's a criminal offense as well. So we got to get to the bottom of it. The biggest issue with this committee is that the stonewalling, the difficulty in getting this information. But I'm working on a number of pieces of legislation as it relates to royalties that NIH scientists receive. As you know, $710 million in royalties they received, when that money should be going back to the taxpayers if it's a taxpayer that's investing in these experiments.
All right, Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, thank you so much for joining us live from Capitol Hill this evening. Coming up, India's prime minister declares victory for his alliance despite his party losing 60 parliamentary seats compared to the 2019 election. We'll look into what this means for U.S.-India relations next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowing today to stay in office despite his party's shock loss of the majority in the country's parliament. India's stocks had their worst day in 4 years as a result of the surprising figures from this election. With more now, Bloomberg News senior editor Bobby Ghosh is joining us from New York. So, Bobby, can you help diagnose why exactly this happened and how much this weakens Modi?
Well, it certainly weakens Modi because he set the bar for himself and his party too high. He's expected to win 400 seats, and it looks like they and the alliance are barely going to scrape to the 272 seat margin that they need to form a government. So that's a big delta between the expectation they set and the actual achievement. They're also down substantially from the last two elections that they won. I think what we're seeing here is that for a lot of Indians, the great sort of shining Indian economy that the Modi government has been promoting at home and abroad, we're learning that for a lot of Indians, that shining economy doesn't really touch them. India may have produced more billionaires in the last 20 years, and you know, there's a sense that India's moment in the global economic scene has come. But for 800 million Indians, they still depend on the dole. They still depend on handouts, and they are not. They don't feel like they're participating. There's not enough jobs. Youth unemployment figures are staggering for a country that is very young. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction that's been bubbling beneath the surface. The very high octane campaigning strategy of the Modi government tended to sort of cover up some of these sort of beneath the surface dissatisfactions. But when it came to actual election day, or several election days, because this was conducted over several weeks, when people actually went to the polls, they were voting with their pocketbook rather than their emotions. And that's why we've seen the outcome we have.
All right, Bobby, it's great to have you back with us. Bloomberg's Bobby Ghosh, we thank you. Kaylee, it's really fascinating to think about this and knowing that the Prime Minister was here quite recently at the White House, and there was a great story the administration helped him tell about foreign investment as an alternative to China. And you wonder if the results would do anything to change that. I think maybe not.
Yeah, of course, the Prime Minister would likely argue that it's status quo. He's still going to pursue the same things because he can form this alliance, but certainly it will be more difficult than it would have been had he been able to maintain that parliamentary majority.
You said it. Thanks to Bobby Ghosh. Coming up, we'll look at primary day in New Jersey and Montana and the lingering Nikki Haley effect. It's next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
New Jersey is one of the last vestiges of machine politics still in the country.
Is it anymore?
And there is this way in which party leaders can manipulate a ballot to be able to give their endorsed candidates preferential placement. I am trying to change that because I think it's more fair to make sure that the people decide, and we don't have these behind closed doors.
Are you waiting for an? That was Congressman Andy Kim on Balance of Power about a month ago, talking about the practice known as the line, a system that organized candidates on ballots by endorsement from local party leaders, giving them what some called an unfair advantage. Kim challenged that system in court and won. He's also now the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for Senate there. As New Jersey residents vote today in their state primary, along with a few other states that we're tracking, and joining us for more on today's primaries, Erin Covey from the Cook Political Report. Erin, it's great to see you. I wonder if you feel strongly one way or the other about the way ending the line might impact results in primaries in New Jersey. The idea here is that it might help the little guy, but when you look across the races that are at hand this evening, what's the impact?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I think this will be a really interesting test of kind of the impact of machine politics in New Jersey post the death of the county line. For Andy Kim's race, obviously the First Lady Tammy Murphy was running against him for the Democratic nomination initially. Since she dropped out, he doesn't really have a race at this point. But there are some interesting congressional races happening further down ballot that could be a test of the strength of machine politics in New Jersey. So you have Bob Menendez's son Rob Menendez, who is running for election in New Jersey's 8th district. He's facing a challenge from the Hoboken mayor there. You also have an open seat in the 3rd district, which is the one that Andy Kim currently represents. And I think both those primaries will be tests of the impact of the machine politics in the state.
Well, Erin, I'm glad you brought up Rob Menendez because, of course, the father, Bob Menendez, is currently on trial for bribery charges. He announced yesterday that he'll be running for his Senate seat again as an independent. How could the sins of the father affect the son in this primary?
Yeah, that's what everyone is asking. So I think that if this weren't the situation, his son would be in a much safer position. He easily won the race for this open seat last cycle after his father basically cleared the field for him. And so he's never had to run a tough election before. So this is going to be a really interesting test of this. He is trying to kind of separate himself from his father as much as possible. You'll see in campaign signs, he has his name Rob in bold, all caps, where Menendez is in tiny font underneath. And he is attempting to attack Bala, the mayor, and accuse him of having his own ethics issues. So this is clearly that his father's situation is clearly going to be the main storyline of the race. But I think the folks I've talked to in the state still think that Rob Menendez is favored to win, even though it could be pretty close.
That's the Rob campaign, not the Menendez campaign. How about his father's independent run, Erin? I know that there won't be anything determinative in this primary tonight, but he's apparently running this campaign as an independent without a staff. Is this real?
Apparently so. He's apparently secured enough signatures to get on the ballot as an independent in New Jersey, which has a pretty low threshold for that. You know, I think a lot of folks expect that this is just kind of a way for him to be able to still raise campaign funds as he is currently on trial right now. I don't think this is going to have an impact. I think Andy Kim is poised to win the Democratic nomination and will be in a strong position to win the general election in November.
All right, so Menendez is still on trial. That's ongoing. Meanwhile, another trial we've all been paying a lot of attention to has wrapped up, although the appeals process and sentencing has yet to come. That, of course, being the trial of Donald Trump in the hush money case, where he was convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Erin, how do you expect that to trickle down the ballot when we consider even vulnerable Republicans who represent states Biden won, or districts Biden won in 2020, are embracing Trump and his messaging around the verdict and the idea that this was all rigged and unfair and a weaponized justice system against him? How do you see that impacting, say, the odds of Republicans being able to retain control of the House?
Yeah, so it's hard to say. We're still 5 months out from the election. Early national polls have shown, I think, like on average, a 1-point shift towards Biden at the presidential level. But you know, that could fade, that could increase. We don't know what's going to happen. But I do think it's telling the way you've seen vulnerable Republican incumbents in the House respond to this verdict. The majority of Republicans who are in competitive elections, according to our ratings, have come in to defend Trump and dispute the results of the verdict. Meanwhile, there are a couple of members who are staying quiet. And I think that's because a lot of these Republicans are running for re-election in districts that Biden won in 2020 and that he is likely to win again in 2024. So they're in a difficult position. They have to be able to retain crossover support from Biden voters, but they're also going to have to not anger their base so much because they also need the base to vote for them in the general.
We're going to be watching for the protest vote. It's been kind of an ongoing thread here through primary season since Donald Trump became the presumptive nominee. Same for Joe Biden, for that matter. Erin, if we start seeing higher numbers for Nikki Haley tonight, do we read into that as a post-verdict effect, or is that just part of this campaign?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Nikki Haley is actually only on the ballot in New Mexico tonight. There are a couple of other states that have primaries, including New Jersey, but she is the only one who is on the ballot in the states that have presidential primaries in New Mexico. And so that's really going to be the only test. I don't think we can read too much into those tea leaves, just because in general, it is difficult to draw strong inferences from primary protest votes and how that will play out in the general election. A lot of times that doesn't mean that voters are abandoning their support for one candidate. It may just mean that they're registering their frustration in the moment. So we'll see what happens in New Mexico tonight.
Yeah, we'll all be watching for what the margins ultimately look like. We know, to Joe's point, that there's also been a great deal of protest voting against President Biden. We've seen that showing up specifically in protest of his policies around Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza. But we know his problems don't end there, Erin. He also has had a very big issue with the border, something he tried to address today with this executive action. Do you think that actually will translate into more voters for Biden come November, or is he actually potentially just losing more progressives or Latino voters who aren't going to be thrilled with this action?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think with Latino voters, I want to mention that there is definitely a wide range of opinions in terms of how they view immigration as an issue. They are not a monolith. But yeah, Biden is at risk at certainly of further kind of endangering his support from progressives. But I do think that this is something that a lot of vulnerable Democrats in Senate races and in House races were calling on Biden to do. Just because they have seen border security be a number one issue in their races coming up, and being able to point to the Biden administration responding to it will be helpful for them. So I think this is certainly helpful for Democrats in down ballot competitive districts. But, whether that will be offset by loss of support from progressive voters, too soon to tell, I think. But I think this was definitely something that will be helpful in terms of Democrats' ability to take control of the House and their ability to retain control of the Senate.
Erin, it's great to see you. Come back and join us again soon. Erin Covey with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll look at President Biden's executive order we're talking about here on border security and how it could impact the campaign as we add our political panel coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I will never demonize immigrants. I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border. I will not ban people from this country because of their religious beliefs. I will not use the U.S. military to go into neighborhoods all across the country to pull millions of people out of their homes and away from their families to put detention camps while we're waiting deportation, as my predecessor says he will do if he occupies his office again.
President Biden earlier today announcing his executive order to secure the border. You saw and heard it live on Bloomberg. Let's see how the panel feels about it. With us this evening, Ashely Davis, founding partner of West Front Strategies and former White House official for George W. Bush, alongside Alvin Jordan, Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. Great to have you both back at the table. Alvin, who was the audience today? Because all we heard talking about this with lawmakers, with political minds in Washington, is that he's now just made both sides of the aisle angry. We hear from Pramila Jayapal, very disappointing, almost like she's a Republican. So what's the point?
I think today he was speaking to a small portion of the base, but mainly that kind of undecided moderate group that we've talked about consistently over the past couple of months. And I think that's exactly what he was doing today. I think he was, to use the term, spitting straight facts. I mean, he was just pulling up the Trump resume and also the points that we all haven't remembered, I think, so intricately, but he was just pulling it out. These are the facts. This is what will happen if the former president is reelected, and this is how, I stand to approach it. And I thought it was good to see him on the offensive finally after, I think, playing catch up for quite some time.
Well, you say finally, Alvin. Why didn't he do this months ago, Ashely? Is it too late for it to make a difference?
Well, I would actually even say years ago. And Alvin, I'm sorry, this is my only political issue that I'm a Homeland Security person.
Sure.
But this is something that he could. Remember, he overturned 20 executive orders at least when he came into office. So this is something he had the power to do the last 3 years. Obviously, it got out of control. And I do have to say the former president politicized the border more than anybody. But the problem is it's an economic, humanitarian, and national security issue. And so I think it's a step in the right direction. Politically, I think it's too late. If you talk to your strategist, I mean, usually by July, people are making up their minds, and I don't know if there's going to be a big enough change in the border for that to impact the election. But, I mean, from a national security perspective, it was the right thing for him to do. However, There are hundreds of people, at least 365, that have crossed this border that were on the terrorist watch list. Those are the people, and they're here. They didn't turn themselves in, and they didn't get there when they came in. They're supposed to check in for asylum. Those are the people I'm concerned.
So
about.
why not cap daily crossings at 0? Why is it 2,500?
Well, that would be my question back. And I think
so you think that is what's required? People should know. You were like the first person in the door at the Department of Homeland Security.
And the border wasn't as bad then, but in 2007, we were this close to passing comprehensive immigration reform, and then the banks collapsed. So, but no, I think that, again, Trump politicized close the border, build the wall. But if we want to get the system in place and do it right, we have to shut the border. I mean, we have to let some exceptions in. Obviously, there's people from countries that are very, very in trouble in regards to their countries are so bad. But more importantly as well is we're not even talking about the fentanyl crisis. So China has figured out 100% how to get fentanyl into this country through Mexico, and it's continuing to happen. So I do applaud him for doing something today. I definitely think it was too late, but I think that it's, from a non-political point, I think it's a step in the right direction.
Well, when we consider whether it was too late or not, how many minds might realistically change, Alvin, it's worth noting the people we've seen making noise about this, Republicans who were probably never going to vote for Biden anyway, realistically, some progressives who don't have a more progressive choice they could choose in November. They're kind of probably stuck with Biden whether they like it or not. So if those things were already decided, how narrow is the group of minds that could actually be influenced by executive orders like this?
It's whatever the number is of people that were supporting Nikki Haley that had nowhere else to go. You know what I mean? Like, it is a very small number. I do think that even following the conversation that we're having at the desk, like the groups that are either, kind of leaning toward one way or the other or believe one thing or the other, they won't be influenced. And to your initial question of who we're talking to, it's neither of those groups. Mm-hmm. And so I think, regardless of how, vast or wide the group is, I do think that as far as taking a step in the right direction, this was very, I think, targeted at a group of undecideds that might have been more influenced than kind of those two anchor groups of thought.
As we try to figure out the implications, and it's pretty difficult to know how people are going to feel about this in November, we spent some time with Frank Luntz right at this time yesterday, CEO of FIL, Republican-leaning pollster. Here's what he suggested about the impacts of this issue in the campaign.
Immigration, control of the border, fear of crime, fear of destabilization, and who comes across. That issue also benefits Donald Trump by about 10 points. When every vote counts in these key states, I'd rather be talking about immigration and inflation over abortion and democracy.
So I guess there you have it, Alvin. He did make the right decision today. You want to see him go on the offense? He's doing that.
Yeah, I think he really has no choice. And I think after we've seen him kind of run the tour of some of we've seen him in Philadelphia, we've seen him down in Atlanta at Morehouse. Like, I think he's kind of going through the act of checking the boxes. Mm-hmm. And now, I think he's kind of switching gears a little bit.
Is it switching gears, though, to your point, Ashely, too late? When we keep hearing that polls are all the polling we're looking at, it's too early. People haven't made their minds up yet. But you're also suggesting most minds are about to be solidified. So what is the window of time we're working with here where you can make an impact on any issue?
Well, I do think there's going to be an opportunity during the convention. Well, not as much for Biden, but to see who Trump's vice president is. There's argument that vice presidents don't really matter. Mm-hmm. I think maybe in this sense they do. One, because he's a one-term president. And then second, because who knows what will happen with some of these legal cases, and you're laughing at me. But I think that the number of voters we're looking at, are we looking at 8%? Are we looking at 9% of voters that's left? I mean, even the Nikki Haley voters, I understand that was who I was supporting, but I'm still a Republican. So are people, you go home because of the economy, and do you go home because of the border? And I would say most people, and actually this whole other dynamic, we were talking out in the hallway, there were 30% new donors since he was indicted.
Right.
of people that gave money that never gave money before. I mean, this is and then also put RFK in there and all of these other dynamics that we don't know. Does RFK take 8% of the vote? And who does it take it from? Does he take it from Trump, Biden? So I think there's a lot left, but you're exactly right. The number is like this, and we just don't know what that number is. And I don't, love Frank, but polling's not been our best stat lately. Not his, just in general.
Yeah, fair characterization. All right, coming up, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland in the hot seat, testifying before the House Judiciary Committee today.
I will not be intimidated, and the Justice Department will not be intimidated. We will continue to do our jobs free from political influence, and we will not back down from defending democracy.
Our political panel will be back with us after the break as we look at some of the fireworks from that hearing. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Our concern is that the facts and the law aren't being followed. A target is acquired. Here, Trump.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with anything you just said, but I'm not going to comment on it.
Okay, so you won't comment on it, Mr. Attorney General, but you had no problem dispatching Matthew Colangelo. Who's Matthew Colangelo?
That is false. I did not dispatch Matthew Colangelo.
Matthew Colangelo.
That was a testy exchange earlier today between Attorney General Merrick Garland and Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida during Garland's testimony in front of the House Judiciary Committee today. Back with us now for some analysis and thoughts, our political panel, Ashely Davis and Alvin Jordan. So, Ashely, of course, it wasn't just Matt Gaetz that pursued a similar line of questioning. We have seen Republicans largely in the aftermath of Trump's verdict talking about a weaponized Justice Department, even though, and Merrick Garland did say this today, the Justice Department had nothing to do with a state case that was brought against Trump and Trump was ultimately convicted on. Who wins this messaging war?
I mean, it's a political show, and they're both going to take their talking points. And, I would think that I watched some of this today. There were a lot of different questions that weren't the flamethrowers, as Matt Gaetz was. But I have to say that this is probably one of the worst days in being an AG in regards to your job, because the Senate Judiciary and the House Judiciary once a cycle usually have the Attorney General up, and anyone can ask any questions they want. So it just turns into a circus. But my personal problem with all of this is just, and it started under Trump, and it did under before that, too, with Clinton and others. But the politicizing of the Attorney General and the Justice Department just is not good for our country and frankly, the courts.
Yeah, well, there was more than just Joe Biden's testimony at hand or Hunter Biden. This letter from three members of the Freedom Caucus, Chip Roy, Tom Massey, and Andy Biggs, suggesting that it's time to investigate the FBI's involvement. How did they put it here in the letter? The FBI's possible involvement in facilitating the events of January 6th. Now we're talking about unmarked buses and agents in the crowd. Is this tinfoil hat time we're saying this out loud?
I mean, what it seems to me is just kind of a repeat of, the Hillary emails, if you will, as far as let's rework and let's drum up kind of what was productive for us before. And so, yeah, I definitely look at it as a little bit of a theater, if you will, but it really allows for those talking points to be used again. And to the Merrick Garland point, I mean, I can't recall seeing him that animated, if you want to use that word, but what I fear is that in seeing those reactions, that it allows for the talking points of, kind of, no pun, I guess pun intended, trumped up charges in a way that it allows kind of the common man to say, well, these are all things that are kind of put in the former president's way on the path to re-election. And so in that way, I have to, kind of take a pause as I, otherwise find it entertaining.
All All right, well, it was great to have you both, and it's worth noting as well, we were having this conversation against a backdrop of the president's son being on trial
That's a federal
in Delaware,
offense.
which is a federal offense, and there is
So
a DOJ special counsel involved.
While we're at it, starting in about 15 minutes, the congressional picnic gets underway on the south lawn of the White House. Think about the conversation over burgers and dogs. Ashely Davis and Alvin Jordan, great conversation. Thank you for being with us. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.